Screen printing on dark garments can be tricky at first, and even after you've been printing for a while, everyone's always looking for a better white. In this screen printing instructional video, we're going to dive into screen printing white ink on this dark navy garment, both on an automatic press and a manual press. First, let's start with the garment itself. The rule of thumb is the better quality of garment, the tighter your weave, the finer your thread, the better your print's going to look. For example, if your garment were a combed cotton rather than a carded cotton, the garment's fibers would be smoother and closer together. This would give the printer a better substrate and require less ink. Combed cotton shirts can be a little bit more expensive, and if your customer is looking for the lowest cost possible, you may consider the carded cotton garment. The next thing to consider is the material that your garment is made from. This will determine the type of ink you're going to use for the print. 100% cotton garments don't suffer from dye migration, so your ink won't require dye blocking properties, which usually means your ink is thinner and easier to print with. However, if you're printing on a poly-cotton blend or even 100% polyester, then the inks you will use will typically be thicker and contain dye blockers to stop the dyes in the polyester from transferring into the ink during the curing process. For this video, we're going to be using a Hanes Poly Blend shirt, which is a great quality shirt for a great price. Now that we picked out our shirt, let's get to ink. Since we're printing on polyblend garments, we're going to be using a new low bleed white from Ryonet, which blocks some of that dye migration. A good general rule to follow is to ensure that your ink is room temperature and you stir it well with a stick or drill mix it before printing. For older inks that have thickened up over time, you can add some shape or soft hand curable reducer to ensure the ink is usable again. This is important for printing because you don't want your ink to be too thick. Even thick inks, if brought to a good temperature and modulated before printing, can be running and easier to print with again. Now let's talk screens. Thicker inks like white are typically harder to print because, well, they're thicker. So it's very important to have a nice, tight, high-tension screen in order to release the ink during the printing process. A screen with insufficient tension, let's say well under 20 newtons, presents the most problems when printing white ink due to the weight and the density of the ink. On the Rock Automatic, I'm going to be using a 158 special S-thread mesh on a solid lock screen. This tight screen and special thin thread mesh provide me with a nice open area to pass ink through. This screen is above 30 newtons. On the manual mesh, I'm going to be using a standard 110 mesh screen. Since I don't have as much control over the strength and pressure that I'm using to print manually, a lower mesh will make it easier for me to pass through. This screen is about 26 newtons, which is pretty tight. For the emulsion stencil, you'll want to use a little bit thicker stencil, which will help lay down more ink. I typically use the thicker side of the scoop coater or do a 2/1 print. Here I'm using the Crowd Coat emulsion, which provides a nice thick stencil with a 2/1 coat using the sharp side of the scoop coater. Once our image is burned, it's time to confirm the setup is correct. Let's talk about off contact. Off contact is key for getting a good white print. Typically recommend 16 to 1/8 of an inch. For both of these prints, we're going to be using 1/8 of an inch to ensure that we have enough. For the squeegee on the manual, we're going to be using a standard 70 durometer with the ErgoForce squeegee handle, which helps stiffen up that duro. For the auto, since we're printing with a slightly thicker ink, we're going to be using a slightly thicker duro, 70-90-70, which gives us a nice soft edge with a stiff blade. For this print, let's start on the manual press so we can find out what settings work best and replicate that on the auto. For this print, I'm going to be pulling the squeegee. I do find that when printing white ink, I have a little bit more control over the squeegee pressure and angle when I pull. First, I flood the screen. Then I build up my inkwell on the bottom of the squeegee. With a good amount of pressure and about a 70-degree angle, I pull the squeegee. It's important that you keep the blade up so that it doesn't bend. But it's also important that you have enough angle for this thicker ink. Think of spreading peanut butter on bread. You're not going to use the knife vertically, you're going to tilt it at an angle to spread the peanut butter over the bread. I should see the ink impressed in the garment and see the screen pop up after it with no ink left in the image area. It's imperative that you mat all the fibers down and have a nice smooth base for your first print in order to get a nice bright finish. Depending on your customer, you can typically accomplish a finished product one of two ways. First is a print flash print, 1 stroke or 2 strokes each, using a minimal amount of ink and stacking the ink on a dry base, leaving a smoother, more professional print. The second is by stacking the ink without using a flash. For this, you're going to leave a nice solid underbase and then lay the ink up with about 2 passes on top of that, just like peanut butter. If it was my shop, I would definitely use the flash dryer. This looks okay, but with a flash, you definitely have a better result. On the auto, we replicate what we learned. Good off contact check, medium angle about 15 to 20 degrees, good pressure 55 to 60 pounds, nice flood of the screen, a medium print speed back, and boom. looks great with one pass on the rock. Just like the manual, we can do this with 1 or 2 print strokes and it will look okay, but I definitely would recommend doing a print flash print. That'll allow us to have a nice bright print. This can be either done with 2 screens or 1 screen if we put it on multi-print mode. And there you have it. Print came out great. We hope you found this helpful whether you're a manual or an automatic printer. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more great screen printing videos.